Good afternoon and welcome to EUROMED Migration Talks, a web series dedicated to migration in the Euro-Mediterranean region, organized by the EUROMED Migration IV program, implemented by ICMPD and funded by the European Union. Today, I will be interviewing Kingsley Aikins, the founder and CEO of the Networking Institute, based in Dublin, which focuses on training in networking, diaspora engagement, philanthropy, and fundraising. Mr. Aikins, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So let's dive right in. Let's talk about diaspora. So even though diaspora is the product of migration, the public perception of this phenomena is rather divergent. While the migration narrative is frequently emotionally charged and politically toxic, diaspora seems to be depicted as a much more positive phenomenon. Mr. Aikins, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you're completely correct. There's probably few more toxic words right now in the English language than the word migration or migrants. And when you say that word, it conjures up images of jungles in Calais, of trains of people walking up through Central America, tragically of people losing their lives in the Mediterranean. You think of a little 3-year-old baby, Alan Kurdi, who was on a beach, who lost his mother and his brother. Very emotional, very dramatic stuff. But as you say, diaspora seems to be much more positive. It just seems to have a much more kind of a positive hue to it. And it doesn't quite conjure up the same sorts of images. So that's just a challenge. I mean, one of them causes the other, and yet that's the way it is. And I think it's going to be very hard to win that battle, but it's the reality of the world that we're in.
In this regard, you state that a country's diaspora constitutes an immense source of soft power, and that by implementing a diaspora strategy, this can be harnessed and converted into hard impact. Now, could you please explain how this can happen? How can we convert a soft power into a hard impact?
Yeah, well, if you just look at the sheer volume of the numbers, there's about 270 million people now live in a country other than the country they were born in. In 1990, that was 150 million. So it does constitute this notion of soft power. Now, soft power was a concept which was first written about by Professor Joseph Nye, who was a professor in Harvard. He wrote a book called Soft Power. And in essence, soft power was the ability of a country, a city, a region to achieve its objective through attraction rather than through coercion. So if you like, the Second World War was an example of hard power. The Marshall Plan was an example of soft power. And this is an interesting notion that countries possess such a thing as soft power. And it's particularly applicable to smaller countries who don't have great military might or even economic power. But they do have large groups of people who have left these countries and are around the world. And that's what constitutes this kind of this sort of resource that they have. And what we say is that lost actors can now become national assets, if you like. And we've developed in the Networking Institute, we've developed this concept of diaspora capital, that countries or cities or regions possess diaspora capital, which is made up of 3 flows: flows of people, flows of knowledge, and flows of money. And so now people are beginning to realize that this concept exists and this potential exists. And it's, of course, it's been accelerated by telecommunications and technology has made these lost actors, if you now, actually closely and integrally involved back with their countries of origin or ancestry or affinity. And so this is an interesting idea. And in fact, the whole idea that there's a difference between the state and the nation, the state being lines on a map and the nation being a global notion. Now, I come from Ireland, a small country, small little country at the edge of Europe, an island off the edge of Europe. But we would consider ourselves as having a significant, we even sometimes talk about the notion of an Irish empire, not built by military might or force of arms, but just by the fact that because of history, so many people left this country, went around the world, and now they are for us a really important resource. And they're part, and that's recognized at a very official level, at a governmental level. It was part of our constitution back in 1937. We have a ministry of a diaspora. We have a minister for the diaspora. We have an engagement around the world in lots and lots of different areas. And this notion of diaspora capital, which we very much buy into in Ireland, it really encompasses lots of different areas. And it could be trade and investment, it could be tourism, it could be remittances, it could be philanthropy, it could be education, it could be tourism, it could be sport. And so we like this very broad definition of philanthropy, of diaspora. And we actually think that countries have diasporas, cities have diasporas, regions have diasporas, companies have diasporas. If you think about it, like the greatest company diaspora in the world is probably McKinsey, who have 30,000 people who used to work there, but they're still closely involved. Sports teams have diasporas. You know, you're an Italian, you watch what's happening with Milan or Lazio or whatever your Juventus, whatever your team is, they have diasporas. And I think when you think like that, it opens up some great possibilities. One of the great examples here would be universities have diasporas, but they don't call them diasporas, they call them alumni. But actually they're the same thing. And if you look at the US, particularly university alumni systems they have to connect with their alumni, they're very powerful. They produce great resources. They're very influential global networks. And that's exactly the same model that countries can follow. And you can actually do it on two different levels. You can engage a lot of your alumni at a modest level of participation. And you can engage a small number of your alumni with very serious and significant levels of engagement with the university. Same difference for countries. That's why it's important.
But then, reflecting on what you just said, we can see that patterns of migration have changed in ways that strengthen, as you say, the potential for diaspora engagement. Yet, many governments still today lack the capacity to design and implement effective policies on a meaningful scale. Building on your experience, how could governments then engage in a more effective manner with their diasporas?
Well, I think you're opening up a really interesting question and debate, and it is the following. In terms of diaspora engagement, what's the role of government? Should governments be facilitators or should governments be implementers? My experience and what I was involved in was very much governments playing a role of facilitation, of supporting, of being the enabling organization to help diaspora engagement flourish. But it allows it to flourish through lots and lots of different non-governmental organizations, and that works really well. However, some countries, there aren't those non-governmental private organizations, if you like, rather than public organizations, and governments have to become implementers. So that's a really interesting question. What's the role of government? What should they do and how should they do it? You know, governments do have some benefit pluses. Very often they have sufficient resources to do something. They also have consulates and embassies. So they have a structure around the world which can build these networks. We sometimes call them A&I networks, affluence and influence, networks of people who really want to engage back in their country of origin. So my view is that the best role for governments is to be for countries is to be partly governmental support and lots and lots of non-governmental organizations. And there are around the world hundreds of thousands of non-governmental diaspora organizations, and some of them are related to business, some of them are related to culture, and some of them are related to language or religion or sport. But it is having a kind of a mix of those two is probably the best and optimum situation. But I do think you still need all the time, you need government imprimatur, you need government official support for what's happening, and governments can act in this kind of creating the enabling conditions. And in some cases can go so far to participate financially. So for example, in Ireland, we have what's called the Emigrant Support Programme, which is a government funded programme. And the government spend about 12 million euros a year supporting organizations, Irish organizations around the world, all outside Ireland. And particularly for those people who have issues or struggling, they may have mental health issues, they may have aging issues, they may have various different issues, helping the organizations which help them. So I think that's quite an interesting mix of approaches.
When we talk about networking, we must talk today about social networking. Social media has definitely shortened the information cycle, and it can represent a relevant tool to strengthen diaspora communities regardless of their location. What possibility does technology offer to countries to engage with their diaspora at a mass level? Can social media help?
You know, I think so. I think, in fact, I would go so far as to say is that this is the big game changer. This is the big shift. This is the big change. Because historically, you know, when you left your country, you know, I think of my situation. My great grandmother had 3 children who went to Australia, and she never saw them again. You know, those days, to an extent, are over for many, because people are now quite international in their movements. They're here and there. They live transnational lives. Many of these people, they're over and back, and they're connecting instantaneously with their country of origin or ancestry or affinity. So in the old days, your geography dictated your identity. If you lived in Southern California, that's who you were, Southern Californian. Now we say geography is history. You can lead a hyphenated life. So you can be Italian and live in Brussels. You can be Polish and live in New York. You can be Australian and be involved in Greece. And that's what's happening. People are having these hyphenated lives, in no way diminishing their allegiance to the country they live in, but also very engaged to the country that they were either from or born, or their parents were born. And that's a really interesting dynamic. And that's been driven now by technology, by communications. You know, in the old days, absence equaled exile. When you were gone forever. We live in a world now where it's more important what you do than where you are. That's a new phenomenon. And I mean, this COVID world we're now living in, we don't know where anybody is or are right now. There are people working. We have, you know, lots of people working for Google and Facebook, which are the companies based in Dublin, but they're living in Germany or Italy or Poland. So that's an interesting dynamic. What we're doing today on Zoom is become the norm. The whole technological evolution, we've gone 5 years and 5 months because of COVID. And we've changed the way we work. And this idea that it doesn't really matter where you are, but it does matter what you do. So to answer your question, this is the big game changer for diaspora engagement. This is really exciting. This is opening up enormous possibilities. And I think you're going to see that grow dramatically now.
We talked a lot about opportunities, but of course you have mentioned in some of your work that sometimes diaspora initiatives fail. What are the main reasons for failure when setting up a diaspora engagement initiative?
Yeah. Well, I find in the work I do and I write, the thing people have most interested in is when I write about why diaspora initiatives fail. And I think you can actually learn possibly a lot, or certainly more, from your failures than you do from your successes. And I think a lot of diaspora initiatives are like fireworks. They start with great enthusiasm, they shoot up into the sky, they look fantastic, and then they die. And they die for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people lose enthusiasm, but sometimes people just run out of money, and money is the oxygen for diaspora engagement. If you don't have money to support these programs, then they're not going to survive. Also, we tend to be sometimes quite simplistic in our mathematics about diasporas. We tend to think, for example, there's 2.5 million Jamaicans who live in the United States. People born in Jamaica, they live in the United States. And some people say, well, if every Jamaican gave $10 to create jobs in Jamaica, we'd solve the unemployment problem. But that's just not the way things work in life. It doesn't work like that. It's what we call fuzzy math. So people often get that confused. I think diaspora initiatives often fail because the organizations that are running them are often quite weak. As I said, they lack resources. Sometimes there's political agendae. People are doing this for political reasons. Sometimes there's resentment from the diaspora to the home country. They sort of blame the home country for the reason they had to leave. That can be a problem. The biggest problem in diaspora engagement is a really simple one, which is a question of data and information. And this is a very simple question you have to ask about your diaspora, which is who are they, where are they, and what are they doing? And many people don't have that information. They don't have that basic information. So there's also often a lack of trust between diaspora and home countries. Sometimes that's to do with politics. And, there's a lack of asking, you know, and it's very important that you become good at asking to engage your diaspora. So there are quite a fair number of reasons why sometimes diaspora initiatives fail, but I think by being aware of this failure, we can learn. The interesting thing about diaspora engagement, it's a non-competitive industry. So we all can learn a lot from each other. You know, somebody going to help Poland or Portugal or Peru is not going to help Switzerland or Swaziland, you know. So this is non-competitive. We have a lot to learn from each other. So things like what we're doing today are important, and what ICMPD do and all the different international organizations, they're important because countries can learn best practice from each other. I sometimes joke that I'm a founder member of a group called CASE, C-A-S-E, which stands for Copy and Steal Everything. In other words, find out which country is doing something good and interesting and see, can you implement it? I mean, I think a good example here is India, which up till about 15 years ago, India didn't really have any diaspora strategy. In fact, there wasn't a very good relationship between India and her diaspora. In that year, about 2002, they did a survey of the Indian diaspora all around the world. And it was the survey of the Indian diaspora. And it's available. You can read it online. It's about 700 pages. And they discovered a series of things in that survey about trust and about the desire for these people overseas to be connected back with India. And they introduced some dramatic changes. They introduced a new passport, an overseas citizen of India. They introduced changes to the law about owning property and owning shares in India. They started an annual conference in January of Indian CEOs from around the world. The Indians are now the most successful ethnic group in the United States. Indians now run some of the great companies of the world, like Google and Microsoft and Pepsi and companies like that. And so what India now sees is these people are a terrific resource for India, that we should reach out to them. And if you watch Prime Minister Modi, as soon as he became Prime Minister a couple of terms ago, he was in Melbourne at the cricket ground for the Indian groups. He was in Wembley Stadium. He was in Madison Square Garden. And they've created this image of global Indianness, which is really interesting. And they've changed what people think about India through their diaspora, through the success of their diaspora. And they've got a whole series of programs to engage their diaspora. A lot of us can learn from India because it's quite a recent phenomenon, and it's been very successful.
Mr. Aikins, my last question today is a topical and timely question. You say that diaspora are more important than ever now. Why is that, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, where people are moving a lot less? Why is diaspora more important now than ever?
Well, you know, one of the phenomenon that we didn't talk about diasporas is their role in sending money back home to their home country. So what we call remittances. So remittances now are about 700 billion US dollars a year. And that's what goes through the banking system. And we know there's a lot more goes more informally. So you might be looking at remittances being about $1 trillion US dollars a year going back to home countries. And those remittances, they don't go to a government or a city or a region. They go to a family. And that money is spent on food and clothing and education and buying household goods. This goes directly into consumption into these countries. So that's really important. But particularly now, given that people are really struggling under COVID in many of these home countries, whereas people who are working overseas are in a position to send back money. And in the old days, the great shifts of money in the world were what we called ODA, official development assistance. Now, the great shifts of money in the world are remittances, which are now at least 3 times, if not 4 times, the amount of ODA. So the importance now of diasporas in shifting money back is really significant. And if you look at diaspora engagement as a pyramid, if you like, at the bottom, you have remittances. And then you can move into philanthropy and supporting social ventures. And then you get into investment. And then you get into engaging in institutional change back in the home country. So there's an evolutionary process in all of this. And because of technology, as we chatted about earlier, now we have people who have resources, who have the technological ability to connect and have this desire to do something back in their home country. This whole notion of a sense of belonging, which people very much have. And a final generator is that we have this issue of the intergenerational transfer of wealth. So the greatest amount of money ever made in the history of mankind is now in the hands of people aged 60 and over in the developed Western world, and they have to decide what they're going to do with that money. And the one thing they can't do is take it with them. They have to figure out what they're going to do. And they can do three things with their wealth. They can give it to their kids, they can give it to the government in tax, or they can give it away philanthropically, which will include diaspora engagement. I would have been very aware of an Irish American called Chuck Feeney, who was an extraordinarily successful businessman who gave away all his money, which was about $8 billion US dollars. And he gave $2 billion to education back in the country of his ancestry, which is Ireland. So we would not have the educational system today in Ireland were it not for this one person. So every country has to find their Chuck Feeney, and they are there, maybe not at that level, but they are there. And they're going to have to decide how they're going to transfer their wealth. And as people get older, they often reflect back a lot on where they came from, their heritage, their ancestry. And we sometimes say life is about going from struggle to success and from success to significance. And that's the period when people start thinking about how they want to distribute their wealth. And part of that is going to be to support their country of origin. And that's why diaspora engagement is so important.
That is a fantastic story and a fantastic hope for the future. Mr. Aikins, thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview with us.